In 1148 CE, Kalhana, a man with literary and scholarly ambitions, began writing a book. Kalhana belonged to a well-connected Brahmana family of Kashmir. His father Chanpaka was at one time closely associated with the royal court, but by the time Kalhana was born, the family had fallen out of favor. Kalhana worked hard for 2 years, recording local traditions and examining manuscripts, chronicles, inscriptions, coins, and monuments. He drew on his family members' political experience and his personal observation of events that were unfolding in his own lifetime. The book was completed in 1150 CE and was titled Rajatarangini, River of Kings. Consisting of 8 cantos, each called a taranga, wave, it gave a connected account of the kings of Kashmir from the early ones of legend to the historical rulers of the 12th century. Kalhana is often described as India's RST historian. He asserts in the Rajatarangini that a person who recounts the events of the past must do so like a judge, without bias or prejudice. However, his book does not always distinguish between fact and legend, and often explains events by citing fate. It is not surprising that there are differences in perspective between a 12th century historian such as Kalhana and historians of more recent times. Moreover, Kalhana considered himself primarily a gifted and skillful poet, one who could make pictures of the past come vividly alive. He described the natural beauty of Kashmir with pride and feeling, wove lively character sketches, and gave dramatic descriptions of political events. The past, like the present, is complex and can be looked at from many perspectives. There can never be a single, perfect history. There can never be a complete or exact picture of what happened in the past. The task of the historian is to bring us as close as possible to such a picture. Historical analysis involves carefully examining the available sources of information, searching for fresh evidence, and devising creative, innovative ways of interpreting historical data. It involves asking new questions and searching for new answers to old ones. Debate and disagreement are an important part of the growth of all forms of knowledge, and history is no exception. All historical interpretations are ultimately based on evidence derived from the sources of history, conventionally divided into 2 categories: literary and archaeological. From a historian's point of view, literary sources include all texts long or short, written or oral. Archaeological sources include all tangible, material remains. But these distinctions are not absolute. All remains of the past, including literary manuscripts, are actually material in nature. And certain kinds of archaeological sources which have writing on them, inscriptions, coins, and inscribed images, can be considered both material objects and texts. The ways in which historians have used different kinds of sources to construct the history of ancient and early medieval India will become clear as you read this book. This chapter gives a broad overview of the major sources, highlighting their general features, and the important issues that have to be kept in mind while using them as windows to the past. Reading ancient texts from a historical point of view. All literary works are connected to the historical contexts in which they are produced and in which they circulate. However, an ancient text does not necessarily offer a simple or direct reaction of the society of its time. It constitutes a complex representation of that society in a refracted image of the past. Information has to be teased out with care. Primary sources. Ancient palm leaf manuscripts. Paper was invented in China in the 3rd century BCE. New techniques led to its increasing use, and by the 4th century, paper had replaced bamboo strips as standard material for writing in that country. Woodblock printing probably began during the rule of the Sui dynasty, 581 to 618 CE, and became popular during the Tang period, 618 to 907 CE. In India, on the other hand, traditional writing materials and methods continued to be used for many centuries. Ancient Indian manuscripts were often made with palm leaves. Here is a description of how such manuscripts, known as Talaputra in Sanskrit, Olai in Tamil, were usually made. The leaf used was either from the talipot palm, Corypha umbraculifer, Talai in both Sanskrit and Tamil, or Palmyra palm, Borassus flabelliformis, Sanskrit Tala, Tamil Paina. The talipot leaf is larger, thinner, and more flexible and durable than that of the Palmyra. Talipot leaves may measure about 90 times 8 to 9 centimeters, and the Palmyra ones about 50 times 3 to 4 centimeters. The selected leaves were cut to the right shape and size. They were then pierced in 1, 2, or 3 places, on the left, middle, and right top. A string was woven through these holes, and then wound around the leaves. One end of the string was knotted or was tied to a small object, example a shell, wooden peg, or button, to prevent it from slipping out of the holes. The cover of the palm leaf manuscript was made of wood, dry palm petioles, or in rare cases, ivory. The writer engraved letters on the leaf with a stylus, a pointed, pen-like object. The leaf was then smeared with soot or powdered charcoal mixed with vegetable juice, so that the black mixture filled the grooves and the writing was easy to read. The letters ran parallel to the length of the leaves. In some cases where the leaf was very long or when the text was in verse, the words were written in 2 or 3 columns. If there was a commentary, it was usually written above, below, or sometimes around the text. Page numbers were often given in the right margin. Palm leaf manuscripts had to be stored very carefully as they were vulnerable to many natural hazards such as heat, insects, water, fungus, dust, and fire, as well as the danger of destruction by human hands. Scribes kept the manuscript tradition alive by repeatedly making copies of old manuscripts. This vibrant tradition started declining around the 19th century with the coming of the printing press. There are special techniques for treating and preserving old palm leaf manuscripts. First, the manuscript is fumigated or treated with insecticides, example thymol, chloromate solution, formaldehyde, phosphine gas, or ethylene oxide. The leaves are then cleaned using solvents such as water, detergents, or ethyl alcohol. Next, any split, broken, or damaged portions are repaired. This can be done using special, thin paper and a water-soluble mixture including small quantities of polyvinyl acetate and methyl cellulose. Once the repairs are complete, the leaves are oiled to make them flexible and polished gently with a soft, dry cloth. They can then be restrung and the covers attached. The repaired manuscript has to be stored carefully so that it is protected from any fresh damage. The discovery, preservation, and care of ancient manuscripts are crucial parts of the preservation of the historical heritage. There are thousands of old manuscripts in various parts of the subcontinent whose contents have not yet been studied or published. It is impossible to estimate just how many have been destroyed and how many are waiting to be discovered. Skill and ingenuity to make historical inferences. Many early religious texts were not primarily meant to be read but to be recited, heard, and performed. They were passed on orally from one generation to the next, even after they were available in the form of written manuscripts. A text can be read in many different ways from a historical point of view, but certain important issues have to be addressed while doing so. Foremost among these are its age and authorship. Ancient texts are much older than their surviving manuscripts, and have had a life of their own. They have grown and changed over time, and this process of growth and change, the period of composition, could in some cases have lasted for hundreds of years before they were compiled or given a more or less NAL shape. A text can be used as a source of historical information for the period during which it was composed, but if the composition stretched over a long period of time, it becomes essential to identify its different chronological layers and the various additions or interpolations made over time. This is not easy and requires a very careful analysis of language, style, and content. Certain texts have been analyzed in this manner, resulting in the publication of critical editions accompanied by a critical apparatus. A critical edition is prepared after a careful study of different manuscripts of a text and identifies its original core. The critical apparatus directs attention to variations across manuscripts and different commentarial interpretations. Many early texts were the work of not one, but many authors. Even if many of these authors must remain anonymous, it is important to identify their background and the perspectives and biases they represent, such as those of class, religion, and gender. Other questions that can be asked about these texts include, where were they composed and in which geographical area did they circulate? Who transmitted them and how did they go about doing so? Who was their target audience? What was the place of these texts within prevailing social and political power structures and cultural traditions? Analyzing a text from the historical point of view does not mean mechanically plucking out self-evident facts. The information a text provides has to be carefully understood within the framework of the particular genre or type of literature it represents. In the case of poetry or drama, the analysis requires sensitivity to the literary conventions of the time and the writer's style and imagination. In other cases, a text may represent an ideal, not an actual situation, and it cannot be read as a description of what was actually happening at the time. Ancient texts often contain myths, and although myths can tell us indirectly about history, the two should not be confused with each other. Ancient and early medieval Indian texts can be divided into categories on the basis of language, genre, content, age, and the tradition or class of literature to which they belonged. Linguists and philologists, scholars who study old languages, have divided the languages of the world into different families. Languages belonging to the same family have certain structural similarities and share a significant number of similar, related words, or cognates. For instance, Hindi, Punjabi, Marathi, Bengali, Assamese, Gujarati, Sindhi, Oriya, Nepali, and Kashmiri belong to the Indo-European family. So do Persian, Greek, Latin, German, French, Dutch, Italian, Spanish, Armenian, and many other languages of Europe and Asia. Languages of the Dravidian family Tamil, Malayalam, Telugu, Kannada, and Tulu are today largely spoken in South India. Exceptions include Brahmi, which is spoken in the Baluchistan area of Pakistan, Gondi in central India, and Malto in the Rajmahal hills of eastern India. Santali, Kasai, Mundari, and some other languages of eastern India belong to the Austro-Asiatic family. Certain languages of the northeast, such as Manipuri, Bodo, Garo, and Lushai, belong to the Tibeto-Burmese family. Andamanese, one of the languages spoken in the Andaman Islands, is not apparently related to any of the known language families. The oldest surviving texts in the Indian subcontinent, the Vedas, are in Sanskrit. Sanskrit belongs to the Indo-Iranian branch of the Indo-European family of languages, as do ancient Pali and Prakrit. There were various dialects of Prakrit, e.g., Maharashtri, Shraseni, and Magadhi. Apabitramsa is a term used for the further development of Prakrit up to the end of the first millennium CE. Among the Dravidian languages, Tamil has the oldest literature, followed by Kannada. Many of the other Indian regional languages and dialects we are familiar with today took shape between c. 1000 and 1500. The various languages were not closed, separate worlds, but overlapping and interacting ones. Languages have histories and change with the times. The pre-classical Sanskrit of the Rig Veda is different from the classical Sanskrit of Kalidasa's poetry. The term, classical Sanskrit, refers to the language whose rules were codified by the 5th/4th century BCE grammarian Panini in his Ashtadhyayi. Another important Sanskrit grammar is Patanjali's Mahabhashya, 2nd century BCE. The oldest surviving Prakrit grammar is Vararuchi's Prakritaprakasha, whose date is debated. The ancient Tamil of the Sangam poems is different from modern Tamil. The Tolkapiyam is the oldest surviving Tamil grammar. Parts of it go back to the early centuries CE. Such grammatical texts tell us about the structure of ancient languages, and they also contain incidental historical references to their time. Ancient Indian texts are sometimes divided into religious and non-religious, or secular, texts. Although this is a handy distinction, there are a few things worth keeping in mind. The English word religion attaches great importance to belief, and suggests rigid, mutually exclusive boundaries and distinct religious identities. No ancient Indian word has such a meaning. The Sanskrit Dharma or the Pali Dhamma, for instance, had a broader reference to a path that people should follow or an exemplary way of life. They included many different kinds of things: codes of conduct, social practices, forms and objects of worship, ritual activity, traditions, and philosophical ideas. Ancient societies did not make the kind of distinction between the religious and the secular domains with which we are familiar in modern times. Therefore, we should not be surprised to end an interweaving of what appear to be religious and non-religious themes and content in ancient texts. Some of the major literary sources for the history of ancient and early medieval India are discussed in the following sections. As the volume of texts is considerable, these should only be considered a representative sample. The idea is to give a brief introduction to their range, with a special focus on texts frequently used and cited by historians. Most of these works were not historical texts, i.e., they were not written with the concise aim of maintaining an account of what happened in the past. But, as we shall see in the course of this book, texts of any kind can be used as sources of history. The Vedas. In the Hindu tradition, the Vedas have the status of Shruti, literally, that which has been heard. They are thought to embody an eternal, self-existent truth realized by the rishis, seers, in a state of meditation or revealed to them by the gods. The category of Smriti, literally, remembered, texts includes the Vedanga, Puranas, Epics, Durmash Astra, and Nitish Astra. The word Veda comes from the root vid, literally, to know, and means knowledge. There are 4 Vedas: Rig, Sama, Yajur, and Atharva. The Rig Veda contains the world's oldest surviving poetry, some of it of extraordinary beauty and philosophical depth. Each Veda has 4 parts, the last 3 of which sometimes blend into each other: the Samhita, Brahmana, Aranyaka, and Upanishad. The Rig Veda Samhita is a collection of 1028 hymns, suktas, arranged in 10 books, mandalas. The Sama Veda consists of 1810 verses, mostly borrowed from the Rig Veda, arranged according to the needs of musical notation. The original melodies are, however, lost. The Yajur Veda deals with the details of the performance of rituals. The Atharva Veda is the latest Veda and contains hymns, some from the Rig Veda, but also spells and charms which re-ect aspects of popular beliefs and practices. The Brahmanas, this term should not be confused with the Brahmana Varna or caste, are prose explanations of the Samhita portions and give details and explanations of sacrificial rituals and their outcome. The Aranyakas, forest books, interpret sacrificial rituals in a symbolic and philosophical way. There are 108 Upanishads, among which 13 are considered the principal ones. The Upanishads contain a great variety of philosophical ideas about Sakriti, the body, and the universe, but are most closely associated with the concepts of Atman and Brahman. Within the Vedic corpus as a whole, books 2 to 7, known as the family books, of the Rig Veda Samhita are considered the oldest. The later portions of this Samhita, along with all the other Vedic texts, comprise later Vedic literature. There are several recensions, shakas, of the Vedas, associated with different schools, charanas, of Vedic study and interpretation. The terms shaka and karana are often used interchangeably. The Shaikala Shaka is the only surviving recension of the Rig Veda. The texts of the Yajur Veda are divided into those of the Shukla, white, school and Krishna, black, school. The recensions of the Shukla, also known as Vahasanya, Yajur Veda are the Madhyandina and Kanva. The black school is represented by the Kathaka, Kapashthala, Matrayani, and Taittiriya recensions. The main difference between the texts of the two schools is that the Samhitas of the white school contain only the mantras, prayers and sacrificial formulae, while in the texts of the black school the mantras are accompanied by a commentary describing and discussing various aspects of the sacrificial rituals. The Kothuma, Ranayaniya, and Jaiminaya, or Talavakara, are recensions of the Sama Veda, and the Shaunaka and Papalada of the Atharva Veda. References in inscriptions mention other recensions of the Vedas that once existed but are now lost. Vedic texts comprise a religious literature, and references to possible historical events are few. For example, Book 7 of the Rig Veda Samhita refers to a battle of 10 kings, in which Sudas defeated a number of adversaries who had confederated against him. Historians have tried to reconstruct various aspects of the culture represented in the Vedas, but it is not easy to interpret this vast and complex literature. A major problem in using the Vedas as a source of history is the problem of dating the Rig Veda. The dates that have been suggested for the composition of this text range from c. 6000 BCE to 1000 BCE. Many historians take c. 1500 to 1000 BCE as the period of composition of early Vedic literature and c. 1000 to 500 BCE as that of later Vedic texts. This chronology is essentially based on the tentative dates suggested by Max Muller in the 19th century. Vedic literature forms an important part of the Brahmanical tradition, texts preserved and transmitted by a section of Brahmana males. It reacts their religious beliefs, practices, and points of view. As a source of history, these texts are used for information about life in parts of northwestern and northern India during the 2nd and 1st millennia BCE. But apart from the question of dates, as we shall see later on, there are several problems in correlating the evidence from the Vedas with archaeology. A number of supplementary texts known as Vedanga, literally, limbs of a Veda, aimed at helping the proper recitation, use, and understanding of the Vedas. These include works on phonetics, shiksha, meter, chhanda, grammar, vyakarana, etymology, nirukta, ritual, kalpa, and astronomy, jyotisha. The broad period of composition of Vedangal literature is c. 600 to 200 BCE. Yaska's Nirukta, a work on the etymology of words in the Rig Veda, belongs to the 6th century BCE. The two Sanskrit epics, the Ramayana and Mahabharata. The two Sanskrit epics, the Mahabharata and Ramayana, fall within the category of Smriti as well as Itihasa, traditional history, although the Ramayana is sometimes classified as Kavya, poetry. Similarities in language and style suggest that they emerged from a common cultural milieu. The Mahabharata refers to Valmiki and the Ramayana, and outlines the Rama story in a section called the Ramapakyana. The Ramayana in turn mentions the Kurus, Hastinapura, and Janamejaya, although it does not mention the Mahabharata war. The two epics were clearly aware of each other, at least in their later stages of development. The composition of the Mahabharata can be placed between c. 400 BCE and c. 400 CE, and the Ramayana between the 5th/4th century BCE and the 3rd century CE. More recently, Hilta Beadle, 2001, 18-20, has suggested a shorter period of composition for the Mahabharata, from the mid-2nd century BCE to the year 0. Nevertheless, the fact that the different stages in the composition and development of the epics could well have spanned many centuries, possibly even a millennium, should make it obvious why most historians no longer use the term epic age. The epics are magnificent texts with powerful stories that have captured the imagination of millions of people over the centuries. To use them as historical sources, it is necessary to identify their internal chronological layers, which is not an easy task. According to tradition, Rama lived in the Treta Yuga, age, and the Mahabharata war happened later, in the Dvapara Yuga. However, some historians argue that the events and characters associated with the Mahabharata recent a slightly earlier period than those of the Ramayana. This is because the setting of the Mahabharata is the Indo-Gangetic divide and the upper Ganga valley, while in the Ramayana, the center of political gravity had clearly shifted eastwards, to the middle Ganga valley. The strong women characters of the Mahabharata suggest an earlier stage of social development, when women were less subordinated to men compared to later times. The practice of Nyaga, levirate, i.e., when a husband deputes his conjugal rights over his wife to another man in order to produce an heir, in the Mahabharata also suggests a social stage that is prior to that of the Ramayana, which reenacts much stricter controls over women. The Mahabharata consists of 18 parvas, books, and has two main recensions in northern and southern. The core story concerns a conflict between two sets of Kausans, the Kauravas and the Pandavas, in a great war that was fought between them at Kurukshetra. But the text also contains a huge amount of material that has little or no connection with the main story. According to tradition, it was composed by Vyasa, but in its present form, it is clearly not the work of a single individual. The Mahabharata is truly an encyclopedic work, and it boasts of this fact. A heroic story formed the core to which many other stories, sermons, and didactic portions containing teachings, were added over centuries. The additions include the sermon on Dharma given by Bhishma as he lay dying on a bed of arrows, and the stirring discourse of Krishna to Arjuna on the eve of the war, known as the Bhagavad Gita. Whether a bitter war between the Pandavas and the Kauravas ever happened cannot be proved or disproved. It is possible that there was a small-scale conflict, transformed into a gigantic epic war by bards and poets. Some historians and archaeologists have argued that this conflict may have occurred in about 1000 BCE. The Ramayana exists in the form of two main recensions, northern and southern. The northern recension can be further divided into the northeastern, northwestern, and western. The language of the northern recension is more elaborate and polished than that of the southern one. The epic consists of 7 kandas, books, of which the Rst, Balakanda, and last, Uttarakanda, are later interpolations. The basic story is about Rama, prince of Kosala, his banishment to the forest due to the intrigues of his wicked stepmother, the abduction of his wife Sita by Ravana, the king of Lanka, Sita's rescue, and Rama's return to the capital, Ayodhya, to become king. The compact vocabulary and style indicate that the core of the text was the work of a single individual, traditionally identified as Valmiki. Valmiki appears in the Balakanda, where he is inspired to compose the epic, and in the Uttarakhanda, where he gives refuge to Sita who has been disowned by Rama. Excavations at the site of Ayodhya have indicated the existence of a settlement here from the northern black polished ware, NBPW, phase, which may go back at the earliest to c. 700 BCE. However, as with the Mahabharata, the archaeological evidence does not tell us whether there is any historical basis to the events or the characters of the Ramayana. The popularity and dynamism of the Rama story is indicated by the fact that apart from the Valmiki Ramayana, which seems to be the oldest version, there are numerous other tellings of the Rama story: a Jaina version, the Pamakaryu of Vimlasuri, in Prakrit, a Buddhist version, the Dusharatha Jataka in Pali, a 12th century Tamil version by Kamban, the Iramavataram, and the Ramcharit Manas, 16th century, by Tulsidas, to name only a few. There are also innumerable oral versions of the story. The Rama legend has enjoyed great popularity in other parts of Asia as well, and there are various tellings of the story in Tibet, Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, and Indonesia. The various tellings often have different beginnings and endings, and characters and events are molded in different ways. See Richman, 1992. For instance, in the Pamakaryu, Ravana is presented as a tragic hero who is killed by Lakshmana, not by Rama, who embodies all the Jaina virtues, including non-violence. Apart from written and oral versions of the story, the Ramayana has also been the subject of art and performance sculpture, painting, plays, dance dramas, and television serials. The epics can be read in many different ways from the historical point of view. While most scholars have focused on debating the historicity of their events, some have tried to describe their many different cultural layers. Another approach is to read such texts as a response to a specific kind of historical context. For instance, James L. Fitzgerald, in Mittal and Thursby, 2005, 54, has argued that the Mahabharata was a Brahmanical response to certain specific historical developments, the increasing popularity of religious traditions such as Buddhism and Jainism, and the rise of dynasties such as the Nandas and Mauryas, who extended support to them, were perceived by a section of the Brahmanas as threatening the Brahmanical order. The Mahabharata was their response to this perceived crisis. Archaeology and the Mahabharata. Archaeological explorations and excavations at places mentioned in the Mahabharata, e.g., Hastinapura, Kurukshetra, Panipat, Tulpat, Bugput, Mathura, and Beray, have given evidence of a pottery called painted grey ware, PGW, which goes back to c. 1000 BCE. This shows that these sites were inhabited around this time, and the nature of the remains suggests that the people who lived here shared a pastoral-cum-agricultural lifestyle. There is another sort of evidence from Hastinapura. The Matsya and Vayapuranas state that during the reign of King Nichikshu, 5th king after Parikshit, grandson of Arjuna, who became king after the war, due to a flood in the Ganga, the capital was shifted from Hastinapura to Kaushambi. Excavations at Hastinapura gave evidence of a flood in the Ganga, after which the site was deserted for several centuries. However, it is not necessary that this was the same flood mentioned in the Puranas. There is a strong local tradition that the Purana Kila in New Delhi marks the place where Indraprastha, the capital of the Pandavas, once stood. Shams Siraja Fif's Tarakai Firas Shahi, 14th century, states that Indraprastha was the headquarters of a Pargana district. A 14th century stone inscription found in Narayana village in West Delhi also mentions Indraprastha. The 16th century Anayak Bari of Abul Fazl states that Humayun's fort was built at the place where Indraprastha, capital of the Pandavas, was located long ago. In fact, till the end of the 19th century, there was a village called Indarpat inside the fort walls. Excavations carried out at the Purana Kila between 1954 and 1971 revealed several archaeological levels ranging from the 4th century BCE to the 19th century CE. The discovery of a few stray pieces of PGW indicated the possibility that an older settlement was located somewhere nearby. However, there is no way of knowing for sure whether this settlement had any connection with the Mahabharata legend. Archaeology cannot really prove or disprove the historicity of epic events or characters. The crux of the matter is that there is a qualitative difference between the nature of literary and archaeological evidence. The epic imaginatively weaves together an event-centered narrative about people and places. Archaeology, on the other hand, tells us about general patterns of material culture, and cannot easily be used to corroborate textual details about individuals or events. The chronological layers in the Ramayana. On the basis of a careful analysis of language, style, and content, J. L. Brockington, 1984, has identified 5 distinct chronological and cultural stages in the development of the Ramayana. The epic started taking shape as an oral composition during the 5th to 4th centuries BCE, stage I. The story emphasized the heroic element and its geographical horizons were limited. The material culture and social structure represented were relatively simple, the religious ideas and practices closer to those of the Vedas than the Puranas. In stage 2, dated 3rd century BCE, 1st century CE, there was a shift from the heroic to the aesthetic element. The geographical awareness of the text expanded eastward into the lower Ganga Valley. References to social and economic life, such as the emphasis on the chastity of women and the descriptions of cities and trade caravans, suggest increasing levels of class stratification and subordination of women. The power of the king was emphasized and warfare had become more elaborate. The story was imbued with a religious significance. Stage 3 belongs to the 1st to 3rd centuries CE. By then urbanization had spread to many new areas. The division of society into 4 varnas was emphasized. The king was exalted as a protector of his people and the social order. The subordination of women had increased. Vedic gods such as Brahma and Indra were still important, but Vishnu and Shiva had appeared on the scene and were exalted. Books I and 7 were added to the epic during this period. In stage 4, 4th to 12th centuries, the religious and aesthetic emphasis increased. Descriptions of society underlined the preeminence of the Brahmanas and the low position of the Shudras and outcasts. References to the inauspiciousness of widows and the practice of sati, the ritual self-immolation of widows, reflect the increasing subordination of women. Vishnu and Shiva emerged as supreme gods in a religious milieu marked by temple worship and pilgrimage. The trends visible in the 4th stage were strengthened from the 12th century onwards, stage V. Apart from these different cultural stages, Brockington also identifies corresponding changes in the delineation of the main characters of the story. For instance, he argues that in stage I, Rama was essentially considered an exemplary human and that it was towards the end of stage 2 that he started being conceived of as divine. In stage 3, Rama's victory over Ravana came to be presented as a victory of Dharma, righteousness, over evil. Although there are references to devotion to Rama in this stage, the divine character of Rama, his association with Vishnu, and his description as an incarnation, avatara or pradurbhava, of Vishnu are regular features of stages 4 and V. Brockington talks of the transformation of a heroic epic into a religious epic. However, Pollock, 1991, 52, argues that the Ramayana was pervaded by the idea of Rama's divinity from the very outset. The Puranas. The word Purana means old. According to tradition, the Puranas were composed by Vyasa, but it is clear that in the form in which they have come down to us, they were not the work of one person nor of one age. There are 18 Mahapuranas, great Puranas, and many more Upapuranas, secondary Puranas. The standard list of the 18 Mahapuranas includes the Vishnu, Narada, Bhagavata, Garuda, Padma, Varha, Matsya, Kurm, Linga, Shiva, Skanda, Agni, Brahmanda, Brahmavavarta, Markandeya, Bhavishya, Vamana, and Brahma. The origins of the Puranas may have overlapped to some extent with the Vedas, but their composition stretched forward into the 4th to 5th centuries CE, and in some cases, even later. The Puranas are supposed to have VE characteristics, Punchalakshanas, i.e., they are supposed to discuss VE topics: the creation of the world, Sarga, recreation, Pratisarga, the periods of the various Manas, Manvantaras, the genealogies of gods and rishis, Vamsha, and an account of royal dynasties, Vamshanucharita, including the Suryavamshi and Chandravamsi kings, whose origin is traced to the sun and the moon. Actually, not all Puranas deal with all these VE topics, and most of them deal with much more. The conception of time in the Puranas is mind-boggling. There are 4 ages or yugas: Krita, Trita, Dvapara, and Kali, all consisting of thousands and thousands of years. These 4 yugas make up a Mahayuga, and 1,000 Maha-yugas constitute a Kalpa. Every Kalpa is divided into 14 Manvantaras, each presided over by a Manu. One yuga follows the other, and the periodic destruction of the world is followed by its recreation. This cycle of time is connected with the cyclical decline and revival of Dharma. The earliest parts of the Puranic genealogies are either entirely or partly mythical. The later genealogies of kings of the Kali age, which, according to tradition, began the day Krishna died, 20 years after the Mahabharata war, have historical material. The AC count is given in the future tense in the form of a prophecy, because Vyasa is supposed to have lived at the end of the Dvapara Yuga and the beginning of the Kali Yuga, before the events he is supposed to be describing. The Bhavishya Purana is mentioned in some Puranas as the original authority for the genealogies, but the present versions of this text have incomplete material on the subject. Although their details do not always match, the Puranas, especially the Vayu, Brahmanda, Brahma, Hadivamsa, Matsya, and Vishnu, do provide useful information on ancient political history. They refer to historical dynasties such as the Haryankas, Sheshanagas, Nandas, Mauryas, Shungas, Kanvas, and Andhras, Satavahanas. They also mention certain kings, with names ending in the suffix Naga, who ruled in northern and central India in the early centuries CE, about whom very little else is known. The dynastic lists end with the Guptas, 4th to 6th centuries, indicating that most of the Puranas were compiled at about this time. However, some are later, e.g., the Bhagavata Purana belongs to the 10th and the Skanda Purana to the 14th century, with additions made up to the 16th century. The Puranas have accounts of mountains, rivers, and places, which are useful for the study of historical geography. They also recite the emergence of religious cults based on devotion, especially towards the gods Vishnu and Shiva and the goddess Shakti. This devotion was expressed through the worship of images of deities in temples, pilgrimage, tirtha, and vows, vreda. Some of the Puranic myths, such as the stories of encounters and interactions between demons, Rakshasas, Asuras, gods, devas, and sages, rishis, are interpreted by historians as allegorical representations of interactions among people belonging to different cultures. The Puranas had a very important function in the Brahmanical tradition as vehicles of Brahmanical social and religious values. At the same time, they also recite the interaction of Brahmanical and non-Brahmanical cultural traditions and the emergence and development of Hindu religious practices. The Durmashastra. The Sanskrit word dharma, from the root dri, meaning to maintain, support, or sustain, is very rich in meaning and difficult to translate. The concept of dharma is based on the idea that the universe is governed by a certain natural law and that the moral laws guiding people's lives should be in consonance with that natural law. Dharma refers to the proper, ideal conduct of a person living in society, a course of action which leads to the fulfillment of the goals of human life. These goals, known as purusharthas, are dharma, righteous conduct, artha, material well-being, kama, sensual pleasure, and moksha, deliverance from the cycle of rebirth. In this scheme of things, material gain and sensual pleasure are considered desirable goals, if pursued in accordance with dharma. The concept of dharma is closely tied up with the idea of samsara, the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. The fruits of dharma include the acquisition of spiritual merit, punya, and its impact is supposed to be felt not only in this life but in future lives as well. The obligations of dharma are considered as applicable to and binding on everybody. Therefore, dharma also means duty. A special group of Sanskrit texts dealing specifically with dharma are collectively known as the Durmash Astra. These texts can be subdivided into three groups. The RST2 are the Dharma Sutras, composed during c. 600 to 300 BCE, and the Smritis, c. 200 BCE, 900 CE. The third includes brief and elaborate commentaries, Tikas and Bhashyas, respectively, collections with comments and conclusions, Nibandas, and compendia of views from different texts, Sangrahas, all composed between the 9th and the 19th centuries. As there is little variation in language or style within a particular group of Durmashastra texts, it is not always easy to assign absolute dates to individual works. The Dharma Sutras are part of Vedanga literature as well as the Durmashastra Corpus. Vedanga literature includes the Kalpasutras, aphorisms on ritual, which are divided into Shraddha Sutras, Grihaya Sutras, and Dharma Sutras. Sutra, literally, thread, refers to a style in which ideas are expressed in very short, condensed statements. The Shraddha Sutras deal with Vedic sacrifices that required the use of at least 3 res. The Grihaya Sutras deal with the simpler domestic sacrifices involving the use of only 1 re. The rituals they discuss include daily sacrifices to be performed by a householder, mainly involving oblations of ghee or offerings of hours and fruits. They also describe the samskaras, literally, preparation, arrangement, rituals marking important life stages, such as upanayana, initiation, vivaha, marriage, and antishti, funerary rites. The Dharma Sutras deal with Dharma. Durmash Astra recognizes 3 sources of Dharma Shruti, i.e., the Vedas, Smriti, i.e., the Smriti texts, and Sadachara, or Shishtachara, good custom or the practices of the learned, cultured people. As a matter of fact, the Samhitas of the Vedas do not contain direct discussion of rules of conduct, so the second and third sources of Dharma are very important. A person's Dharma depends on gender, age, marital status, Varna, and Ashrama. The 4 Varnas are Brahmana, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Shudra. The RST3 of these are referred to in the Brahmanical tradition as Dvija, literally, twice born, as they alone have the right to the sacred thread ceremony, which is considered similar to a second birth. The ashrama system went through several stages of development and ultimately divided the life of a Dvija male into 4 stages: Brahmacharya, celibate studenthood; Grihastha, the householder stage; Vanaprastha, partial renunciation; and Sannyasa, complete renunciation. The 4th ashrama is not obligatory. The ashramas represent an ideal scheme, and it should not be imagined that people in ancient India necessarily followed it in real life. Further, it was not supposed to apply, even as an ideal, to women or Shudras. Apart from norms of social behavior, Durmashastra deals with a number of other issues including personal, civil, and criminal law. However, the laws of these law books are not like the provisions of the Indian civil or penal codes. We do not know to what extent their recommendations were actually used or applied in early times. These texts are normative and prescriptive. They talk about the way things should be, from the point of view of a section of Brahmana males who were the Dharma experts and also the implied subject for many of the rules. Although the Durmashastra texts do not directly describe the society of their time, certain inferences about social practices can be made on their basis. Contradictions within or across texts may indicate different opinions among experts, differences in customary practices in different areas, or changes in social norms over time. The Brahmanical tradition had some amount of inbuilt elasticity in order to come to terms with social reality. Theory and practice in the Durmashastra. The Durmashastra texts reveal the tension between theory and practice within the Brahmanical tradition. They divide society into 4 varnas, but also refer to the more numerous jatis, castes, which they explain as the outcome of inter-varna marriages, varnasamkara. Although they assert that everybody must follow the dharma of their varna, they concede that in times of emergency or acute distress, people can follow the duties of other varnas. They refer to the dharma of different regions, desha dharma, castes, jati dharma, and families, kula dharma. Consider the following examples based on the Manava Durmashastra, often referred to as the Manusmriti, a text generally assigned to between c. 200 BCE and 200 CE. A more recent view places it in the 2nd to 3rd centuries CE. The Manusmriti forbids marriage between a man and the daughter of his maternal uncle or paternal aunt. Medatithi, the 10th century commentator on the text, states that such cross-cousin marriages are against Dharma. But Madhav, the 14th century commentator on the Parasharasmriti, gives detailed arguments to show that there was nothing wrong with such marriages, citing Vedic passages and custom. The Manusmriti condemns marriage between a Dvija man and a Shudra woman. But when it talks of the division of property, it specifies the shares to be given to the sons born of a Brahmana, Kshatriya, or Vaishya father by a Shudra woman. The text states that a widow should not remarry. But it fixes the length of time a woman should wait for a husband who is missing, and lays down the inheritance rights of sons with one mother and 2 fathers, i.e., a son whose mother has married a second time. In one place, the Manusmriti forbids the eating of meat. However, elsewhere, it includes meat among the items to be offered to a Brahmana invited to a Shraddha, ceremonies in honor of and for the benefit of ancestors. Example A shows that the author or authors of the Manusmriti and the commentator Medatithi clearly disapproved of cross-cousin marriage. but Madhav apparently lived in a part of South India where such marriages were socially accepted, and so he defended them. Examples B and C indicate that the authors of the Manusmriti disapproved of marriage between Advaita male and Shudra female, and did not approve of women, including widows, remarrying. But as such things did happen, they had to regulate prevailing practice by laying down some rules. Example D similarly shows that the authors of the Manusmriti did not approve of meat eating among Brahmanas, but had to acknowledge the prevalence of non-vegetarianism. The authors of the Durmashastra Texts had to confront and try to regulate a wide variety of social practices. This, to a large extent, accounts for the variations in their opinions and prescriptions.